Well, I agree with the president 100%. Ilhan Omar is a walking example of everything that is wrong with our legal immigration policy. We imported tens of thousands of people who hate America, add no value to it, rob and steal from us. And we're supposed to be okay with it. I don't think Ilhan Omar should be expelled from Congress. I think she should be expelled from the United States. And that's something that I'm working on. But what prompted me to take this position is she decided to send around fundraising emails saying I should be expelled from Congress. Well, if that's her view, she should go for it. And so what I've said is if I'm going to try to expel her, it won't be in a fundraising email. She'll deal with it on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Tonight, everything explodes. A member of Congress just got hit with the one word nobody thought they'd hear: expelled. Power is shaking, chaos is spreading, and the facade is exposed. Ilhan Omar is at the center as calls to deport her ignite a political firestorm. Accusations of fraud, cover-up, and betrayal rocking Washington. You can feel institutions wobble, the narrative collapse, the meltdown on live TV, the sudden walkout whispers, the fear of an invasion of scandals they can't control. Leaders fall, alliances crack, democracy is tested, and the truth is no longer containable. Stay right here, because what happens next changes everything.
6 new indictments and 1 guilty plea were announced yesterday as federal agents executed a search warrant on Ultimate Home Health Services, a Somali-owned home care agency. The new indictment zeroes in on the autism program called Early Intensive Developmental and Behavioral Intervention, or EIDBI, and zeroed in on housing stabilization programs. In the case of the housing stabilization programs, the Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson says defendants claim to provide housing assistance to people with mental illness or drug and alcohol problems, and they say the defendant submitted claims, provided no service.
Look, I'm going to say something up front that the corporate press refuses to say clearly. When you have government programs that are supposed to help vulnerable people and prosecutors are describing them as entirely fraudulent and basically shell companies providing no services, that's not politics. That's not spin. That's a full-blown betrayal of the taxpayer and a betrayal of the people the programs were designed to help. And it's also a warning sign for every American, because if it can happen in Minnesota at this scale, if it can balloon from a modest projection into massive numbers, then it can happen anywhere. And trust me, it will happen anywhere unless somebody grows a spine and enforces basic standards, basic oversight, basic accountability. Because here's what's in your face right out of the gate. Federal agents execute a search warrant. Prosecutors announce new indictments and a guilty plea, and they're talking about fraud in an autism-related program, EIDBI, and in housing stabilization programs. And the language here matters. They're not saying, we found some mistakes. They're not saying, we found a company that overbilled. They're describing something that's way uglier. Companies allegedly providing essentially no services, built to vacuum money out of the system. That's the kind of story that should freeze the country, because it's not just about money, it's about trust. It's about whether government can do anything without being turned into a feeding frenzy for the connected and the shameless. Now let's talk about a phrase that jumped out at me, because it should jump out at you too. Fraud tourism. Think about what that means in plain English. It means people allegedly hearing, hey, it's easy to get paid here, and then showing up to get a piece of the action, billing government programs like it's a vending machine. If that's what prosecutors are seeing, that's not a random crime wave. That's a signal that the system is a magnet for fraud. And when a system becomes a magnet for fraud, it is not because Americans suddenly became worse people. It's because the structure and oversight are weak enough that criminals can operate like it's a business plan. And here's where I think a lot of Americans, especially working class Americans, are completely justified in being furious. Because you know what happens to you if you mess up paperwork? You get punished. You miss a form, you miss a deadline, you misreport something, you're treated like you're the problem. But when the grift is big, when it's organized, when it's wrapped inside a program, suddenly everybody's cautious. Suddenly everybody's careful. Suddenly we're told we shouldn't talk too loudly until 10 years later, when the money is long gone. And then we get the numbers. And the numbers are what makes it impossible to pretend this is normal. A housing stabilization program projected to cost $2.6 million annually, and then it balloons to $21 million, and then it explodes to $104 million. Just sit with that. Imagine your household budget. Imagine your rent, your groceries, gas. And then imagine someone saying, yeah, this program was supposed to be a couple million, and it turned into over 100 million. That's not a rounding error. That's not a whoopsie. That's a crisis. That's why this isn't a local Minnesota story. This is a national story about what happens when government grows, the media cheers it on, and nobody wants to do the uncomfortable part, which is the auditing, the verification, the enforcement. Now, let me say something important, because I don't do guilt by association. I don't do blame an entire community. That's lazy. It's wrong. And it's exactly what the media loves, because it gives them a moral lecture to deliver instead of reporting on fraud.
Thompson used the term fraud tourism, claiming two men from Philadelphia learned there was easy money in Minnesota, so they flew into the state, set up shop, and started billing the government. As far as defrauding the autism programs, Thompson introduced one new case of a defendant recruiting parents, getting bogus documents for a diagnosis of autism for the child. The parents would then get a kickback from the money intended to treat the autistic child.
What we're seeing is programs that are just entirely fraudulent. These aren't companies that are providing some services but overbilling Medicare or Medicaid. These are companies that are providing essentially no services. They're essentially shell companies created to defraud the program, created to submit on a wholesale level.
But I also don't accept the opposite scam, which is because it's sensitive, nobody is allowed to ask questions. No, you ask questions harder. You audit harder. You enforce the law evenly. Because the victims of fraud are not just taxpayers. The victims are also the honest people inside those communities who get smeared by the actions of criminals. The fastest way to poison public trust is to let fraud spread and then act shocked when people stop trusting the system. So what's the political angle here? And why is Ilhan Omar being brought into the conversation? Here's the careful, responsible way to say it. A lot of the suspects and defendants being discussed are connected to the area she represents. That is a fact pattern that makes people ask, where was the oversight? Who knew what? And did anybody in power ignore red flags? But here's what you can't do, and I won't do it. I'm not going to declare she personally stole money, or that she personally ordered anything, or that she personally benefited unless and until there's evidence that holds up in daylight. That doesn't mean you look away. It means you do the thing adults do. You demand audits, you demand records, you demand transparency, and you let investigators follow the money. Period. Because the truth is, a politician doesn't have to be indicted to be part of a rotten ecosystem. And that's what Americans are sick of. They're sick of ecosystems where the right people get contracts, the right nonprofits get grants, the right consultants get paid, the right donors get access, and the working public gets a lecture about compassion while the cash disappears. Now, the transcript you provided leans hard into a narrative about connections. Ilhan Omar, Tim Walz, Keith Ellison, and it brings up things like events, restaurants, associations, and the broader feeding our future scandal. Again, I'm not going to pretend every claimed connection equals guilt. It doesn't. But I will say this, when you have massive fraud in public programs, politicians don't get to hide behind vibes and slogans. Their job is not messaging. Their job is governance, oversight, results. And if they weren't doing that job, if oversight failed on their watch, then yes, they deserve political consequences. That is how it's supposed to work. Here's another thing the transcript gets right. Audits. You want a solution? Audits. Real audits. Not press conference theater, not a little committee meeting where everyone plays to the cameras. I'm talking about turning over every rock. Who got paid for what services? What documentation was provided? Who approved it? How often was it checked? What red flags were ignored? Because let's be real, programs ballooning from millions to over 100 million doesn't happen quietly. That leaves a trail. Somebody signed something. Somebody approved something. Somebody greenlit something. Somebody looked the other way. And if we're going to be a serious country, we don't just arrest low-level operators and then protect the decision makers. Now, let's talk about the part people are using as a political weapon: expulsion. Expel Ilhan Omar. You hear that and you go, wow, that sounds decisive. And I get why people feel that way. She's an aggressive ideological figure. She's said things that infuriate patriotic Americans. She's part of a political wing that has contempt for middle America, contempt for the flag, contempt for the basic idea of national loyalty. So emotionally, people want a hammer. But I'm going to tell you something that might annoy some of my own viewers. Expulsion is not a meme. It's not a slogan. It's an extreme constitutional remedy. It's rare, and it has a high threshold for a reason. Because if you make expulsion normal, it becomes a weapon used against whoever is out of power. That's the reality. So if someone in Congress wants to push an expulsion vote, fine, make your case. But if you don't have the kind of evidence that can withstand scrutiny, all you're doing is creating a circus. And the circus is exactly what corrupt systems thrive on, because it distracts from the only thing that matters: the money trail, the oversight failure, and the reforms. Which brings me back to the breaking style lines that get thrown around online. She's done. She knew. She benefited. Revoke citizenship, deport. I'm going to be blunt. That's not a serious way to do accountability. It's a dopamine hit. It's rage content. And rage content might get clicks, but it often helps the guilty people because it allows them to claim they're victims of hysteria. If you want someone held accountable, you don't need to exaggerate. You don't need to invent. You need documentation. You need investigators. You need clean reporting. And you need to keep the focus on what prosecutors are actually saying and what the records actually show. Here's what we know from your transcript. Prosecutors are describing fraud in multiple programs, including an autism-related program and housing stabilization. They're describing shell companies. They're describing kickbacks. They're describing people allegedly recruiting parents for bogus diagnoses and then paying kickbacks out of money that was intended to treat children. If that is true, that is evil. That is not hustling. That's not getting ahead. That's stealing from disabled kids. And if that doesn't enrage you, you're not paying attention. Now let's talk about the bigger pattern, because this is the part the media never wants to say out loud. We are living under a system where ordinary Americans are treated like suspects, and organized fraudsters are treated like a policy complication. You get lectured about what you can't say, what you can't question, what you can't notice. You get told you're dangerous for asking how money is being spent. And then, when the fraud is exposed, the same people say, wow, who could have seen this coming? A lot of people saw it coming. A lot of whistleblowers saw it coming. A lot of local folks saw it coming. And the problem is, in many places, the political culture punishes the people who ask questions more than it punishes the people who steal. That's why America First politics resonates. It's not because people are mean. It's because they're tired of being treated like fools. Now, let's put it in concrete terms. What does this mean for you? It means you're paying into a system that is supposed to help real people. And when criminals loot it, you don't just lose money. You lose capacity. You lose trust. Then the program gets tightened or cut, and the people who actually need it suffer. That's the cycle. And while you're told to accept shortages and budget constraints, there are networks out there that treat public money like a private revenue stream. This is why I keep saying, you cannot separate corruption from national strength. A nation that can't control its spending can't secure its border. A nation that can't stop fraud can't fund its priorities. A nation that normalizes theft inside compassion programs eventually loses compassion because the public becomes cynical, angry, and unwilling to fund anything. And then, of course, politicians use that cynicism to push even more power grabs because they claim, see, government is broken. Give us more authority. It's a sick loop. So what should happen next if we were serious? First, audits. Not optional, not maybe, audits. Second, clawbacks. If money was paid out for services not provided, you pursue it. You seize assets where you can. You dismantle the business model. Third, reform the program structure so it's not easy to scam. That means verification. That means real documentation. That means periodic checks. That means reducing the incentive for fake billing. Fourth, political accountability for oversight failure. Not because it's fun, because it changes behavior. If politicians know they can't just shrug and blame complexity, they'll start taking prevention seriously. Fifth, stop the media from laundering excuses. I'm serious. The corporate press too often functions like a defense attorney for the establishment. They don't ask, how did this happen? They ask, how do we frame this so the right people don't get blamed? That's how you end up with 10 years of fraud before a real reckoning. And now, the Ilhan Omar angle again. The fair standard is this. If investigators find direct evidence of wrongdoing, it should be pursued like any other case. If investigators find evidence of negligence or enabling behavior, that should be exposed and judged politically. If there's no evidence, then you don't manufacture it. But you also don't pretend it's off limits to ask questions just because someone is controversial or protected by media allies. Because the reason this story has such energy is not just Omar's ideology, it's the sense that there's always a shield around certain figures, and that shield is made of press narratives and partisan instincts. And I'll tell you what makes people snap. When they watch the system go after Trump like it's their religion. Every document, every angle, every rumor, wall-to-wall coverage, while fraud stories that hit taxpayer programs get treated like a regional oddity. That double standard is the fuel. It's why people don't trust the institutions. And honestly, they shouldn't, until the institutions prove they deserve trust. Now, I'm going to close this by bringing it back to something practical, because I'm not here to just rant. If you're watching this and you're thinking, okay, what's the line crossed? It's this. The line crossed is when fraud becomes normalized inside public programs, and the political class treats oversight as optional and criticism as taboo. That's the moment a republic starts to rot. Because once people believe the system is rigged, once they believe money is being siphoned and nobody important will face consequences, then the social contract breaks. People stop cooperating. They stop believing. They stop trusting elections, trusting agencies, trusting courts, trusting each other. And you can't have a strong country like that. So here's my message, and it's simple. Follow the facts. Demand audits. Demand accountability. Don't let the media turn this into